Summer concerts, pool parties, chill nights under the stars. We're stocking up our closet so you're ready to look your best for all of it. At Plato's Closet in West Ashley and North Charleston, we're buying all things summer. So bring in your tees, tote bags, sandals, sunglasses, and more. We pay cash on the spot for gently loved name brand looks. Plato's Closet is the go-to destination for trend-forward teens and young adults who support local and shop sustainable. Visit Plato's Closet today. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
So you might have heard tell that there's a lot of talk about inflation and economic concerns creeping into our politics and cultural discourse lately, and not for ungood reason. The COVID epidemic continues. It looks like the fall might be a lot rougher than people initially anticipated when they thought maybe we were done with this, and people are concerned. And on top of that, there's a lot of supply chain issues from the pandemic of the last 18 months that are just now kind of catching up to the consumer side of the market. So what do we do with all this? Well, it's interesting because our friend Jericho Hill, who's an economist now, has kind of an interesting take on this sort of thing. He thinks the storyline in the media and social media narratives of inflation is actually might cause inflation, or at least make it worse than what it would otherwise be. And when he's talking storylines, he means kind of like a pro wrestling storyline. Now, he's written, as I have, I like to use some pro wrestling analogies when we're talking about politics and media because it fits really well. The idea of manipulated storylines, that the action you're seeing is real, but it's being presented in a certain way, and behind the scenes there's some manipulation of it to get you to think a certain way or to elicit a certain response to it all. Our political media and our politicians in particular are getting really, really good at this, which means we need to get better about discerning what's going on behind the scenes. So we're going to turn to our friend Jericho Hill, who, before he was an economist, safely ensconced into the bureaucratic government system, actually worked in professional wrestling. He worked backstage. He worked on things like being a referee and agenting matches and things like this. So he's the perfect guy to discuss this analogy to us so that we can discuss how politics is faker than wrestling and how something called kayfabe may actually explain some of the inflation concerns right now. Inflation concerns are very real. How real are they? He's going to help us cut through some of the manipulation and overreaction and emotion of it to get to what we actually need to be watching for. So that's what we're going to do today on Heard Tell. We're going to have a little bit of fun with a serious topic: pro wrestling, politics, inflation, economics. It sounds like a big hot mess, but it actually all kind of goes together once we work through it. We're going to do that with Jericho Hill right after this. This is going to be fun because I get somebody that I turn to explain economic things to me all the time for all of our benefit this time. So Jericho Hill, how are you, my friend?
Hey Andrew, it's good to be here today. And yeah, I'm doing pretty good. A little under the weather with the summer cold, but I'm ready for this.
I've turned to you for a while because you do economics. That is your bailiwick. That is your area of expertise. You are now safely ensconced in the bowels of bureaucratic governance. But before that, you had kind of an interesting career path to get there, and specifically to what we're going to talk about today is you are a wrestling referee?
I was a number of things in sort of the professional wrestling, quote, universe, unquote. One of those at a time was I was a referee. Yeah, I did a bunch of other stuff behind the scenes for them, doing interviews with the wrestlers, helping them sort of storyboard ideas and things like that. It was quite an interesting year and a half.
Now, you've wrote about it, and I have as well. I think having a little bit of a background in professional wrestling and the way that product is presented and manipulated and laid out for folks as an entertainment venture is really, really helpful when it comes to discussing politics, because in politics we have the media level, which is a presented story, and then you have what's really going on behind the scenes, and then you have the story of how the manipulation of that behind the scenes goes. You wrote it for us in Ordinary Times, but you found the same thing that I did, that when it comes to talking about things like politics and media, professional wrestling and the storylines of it really is a good explainer on the multifaceted way information is presented to us, isn't it?
It is. When I did my time, so I did about a year, cup of coffee on the Hill, um, working in the U.S. Senate. And so one of the things that you got to see sort of behind the scenes, much like I saw, in the locker room with some of the wrestlers for the organizations I worked with, was in the Senate buildings. There's a rotunda, and that's where a lot of the interviews are done by all the major media outlets. And there'll often be, three or four interviews going on at a time. There might be two Republicans being interviewed and two Democrats being interviewed. And what you see on the cameras of these networks is, of course, the Republicans are blasting the Democrats and the Democrats are blasting the Republicans for whatever policy of the day issue there is. However, when those cameras are off or in between cuts, they're actually talking to each other like they're just normal people, and they're working on their own deals, and they're working on, their own, sort of how are we going to do this committee hearing in 2 weeks, and, hey, your aide had a good idea here, or I can't really sign on to your proposal. Sorry that I have to blast it on the news. But maybe we can talk about, an amendment and I can do something. So that's what I really saw behind the scenes. I think there are those politicians on both sides of the aisle that are hyper partisan and do not play well with others. But I think for the most part, maybe this is encouraging. When the cameras aren't rolling, I think the majority of Republicans and majority of Democrats actually talk to each other like normal people.
I noticed too, it's not just politics, it's also political coverage. I'm reminded of, Jim Acosta for CNN would go to the Trump rallies and they would have, they would be chanting CNN sucks and all this stuff. And then you'd have the pictures off the social media feeds where he's taking selfies with the same people in the crowd afterwards. And we understand people get out of hand sometimes, but there seems to be a large swath of people that are starting to understand that a lot of what we're being presented is a show, and then they kind of start to understand, well, maybe the show, you can call it fake or whatever, but it's kind of just part of the process. You've worked behind the scenes in government a little bit. We need to be grown-ups here and understand that, yeah, it's an entertainment value, but this is just kind of how stuff gets done, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, look, when they're out there and when a politician's out there in front of the camera, they're trying to get folks out there to apply maximum pressure, either folks on their side of the aisle or focusing on the other side, to achieve a particular policy objective. So, you want to get people engaged and activated, but behind the scenes, they're that hyper partisan rhetoric. Everyone understands that. At least most people, I think, understand that's sort of part of the game, and that's there to sort of get their numbers up, get the fundraising up, get the interest in to get that. Sometimes, Andrew, you could say, there are times where a politician on one side could sort of stoke some, activism, and that's actually just a provision for cover for some politicians on the other side that just needed something to be able to say, yeah, I can go along with this here. Like in professional wrestling, one of the things I did was I would work with some of the wrestlers, behind the scenes and behind the curtain on what their talking segments would be, the promos. I'm reminded of a great quote from Eddie Kingston that I put in my article for you guys. When he talks to the camera, he says, "When I talk about myself, it's a shoot, it's real. But when I talk about anybody else, it's fake. It's not real." So in other words, he's going to insult himself, but he's not going to insult others. But these guys are, these wrestlers, they're out there, they're going over their talking points beforehand so they can get the feud across, the story across. And we as professional wrestling fans don't see how that sausage gets made. However, when they come out and do their spiel in front of the camera, we know that this is not real. We know that this is a story. This is like a movie. But we can still sort of let ourselves go and sort of experience the emotional heat of the moment. I think that we don't have that same capacity when it comes to politics. We seem to be treating, what is said in front of cameras as more real than it really is. And that's not to say there isn't significant differences between the two parties and politicians, and I disagree that politicians are all the same. They clearly have different aims and motives. But I don't think that the average consumer of CNN or Fox News I don't think that they're quite grasping that a lot of what they're seeing and put in front of them is just to move numbers and not actually, reflective of what's really going on behind the scenes in a closed door meeting with these folks.
You wrote in that piece for Ordinary Times that folks can read in ordinary-times.com that, and I'm quoting you here, unlike in politics, professional wrestling is predetermined. The winners and losers are known, but how they get there is up to the wrestlers. But voting is more predetermined in politics than the casual observer might think. Leaders will only schedule votes that win, or they should. Because of this, moments like John McCain's thumbs down are so real and feel so truthful. And we've seen this again lately with, ironically enough, John McCain's replacement, Senator Kristen Sinema, did her thumbs down curtsy that went viral, and everybody got in a bunch about that. When we think that things are predetermined like politics, and American people are so cynical about politics, things like that poke through like they do in wrestling because it feels like a rare moment of realness, and then people react even stronger to it, don't they?
Yeah, I think so. I think we know, like, inherently when something's truly authentic. And I think we react to that quite differently. In my time, I only was there on the Hill for a year. I did a lot of work sort of helping, senators be prepped for committee hearings, whether those committee hearings were on C-SPAN, if it was a big committee, or if it was broadcast later on C-SPAN 3. What I saw was, the senators, they have their statements. They're crafted by their aides. Their aides are quite knowledgeable, especially in the Senate, on both sides of the aisle. These are very bright people with good experience. And the questions are crafted such that a senator is not going to simply ask whatever they want. They're going to coordinate with their fellow members of the party, and sometimes with folks across the aisle, depending on the hearing, about who's going to ask what, because certain questions are going to be more beneficial to certain representatives and certain senators, right, because of constituent needs. And so they'll sort of divvy those up based on the constituent needs, as well as what that senator is considered to be more of a, quote, expert in, unquote. And the hearing witnesses, like you often see, Jerome Powell in front of the senators, or you might see the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in front of the senators. Those witnesses have been prepped. Many questions that the senators would have might have found their way somehow to the hearing witnesses, so they have an idea of what they might be asked. Those hearing witnesses have been through a lot of prep. So they have a lot of canned responses ready to go, and some of those canned responses are going to seem very organic. But there's such, these 2-hour committee meetings that typically, go on every week. There's probably, double digit, work that goes in behind the scenes for everyone that's speaking. And I just don't think that, people, see that because they don't observe all that happening, because that's all happening in the representatives and senators' offices and stuff like that.
We just had Dr. Keith Humphreys on the last episode of Heard Tell, and he was talking about, because he just testified in front of the Senate here a few weeks ago, and that hearing was very bipartisan. It was on the opioid crisis. It was the International Narcotics Committee. But since you prepped these committee hearings before, you've been behind the scenes in them. These things are scripted. We understand they're but what should the casual observer that's just watching these hearings look for? What are they trying to see to go, okay, this person's just cutting a promo and doing a thing? And what are they watching in the background to go, okay, this has got some realness to them. These senators are actually engaged, or this congressperson really cares about this issue?
So, one, I think if you have a bipartisan hearing, it gets pretty easy to spot this, because the folks behind the dais, so to speak, they're not competing with each other here. It could be an issue such as cybersecurity, right? That's fairly bipartisan. You'll see the senators actually being engaged and sticking around for maybe longer than just their 5-minute question and answer session. I think that's important for folks to know in these committee hearings. The reason why they're 2 hours is every senator gets a set amount of time for Q&A, as well as opening and closing statements from the chairman and the ranking member of the committee. So, they're really, the senators, they're really trying to maximize their 5 minutes of time with the witness. So one thing to note is like any senator, like typically is going to be asking questions where they're trying to get a talking point or a piece of evidence introduced that they can use to argue for or against a particular bill. Um, and the hearing witnesses are supposed to be able to help them provide those talking points. So it's sort of like, can I get the evidence that I want out there in the public consumption for a news media organization to clip where I don't have to do that, right? And most of the time, this goes off without a hitch. I recall, however, one committee hearing that I was sitting behind the dais. That's the area where the senators sit, where the witness was arguing against a policy a policy recommendation, and the a senator who was the witness was a Republican witness, and so a Democratic senator, asked a question of, why do you not support this bill? You said that X and X organization doesn't support this type of bill because of these reasons, and is that correct? And that was correct because that was in the witness's written testimony that was given to this committee before the hearing started. And the senator then played probably one of the more real moments where he says, well, were you aware that such and such organization actually wrote not one but two letters of support for this very bill right here that we're considering today?
Wow.
And I leave a few moments of silence because that was the crickets. And though that's a very real moment because clearly that witness was not prepared well enough, and a major talking point that the Republicans were trying to get across just completely evaporates, right? And of course, that's happened that would happen to Democrats too. And I'd want to make it clear, I'm just not signaling out, Republicans only, but that was just one of those moments that it just stuck with me of just how real that was of a witness just completely contradicting themselves.
Yeah, when you get a real moment like that, though, how do the senators react? Because we don't really get to see them. You're sitting behind them on the day. Do they adjust to it, or how do they react to something like that when they have a witness and something just goes completely off the rails like that?
So for the most part, as aides and as the senators are going to have really good poker faces, and so they're going to try not to react. Like clearly, when I'm sitting back there and I realize that this witness has been caught in a trap, I'm not going to go, right? That would not look good because the camera could potentially be on me. But what you would see is, and I didn't see this in this question, was one of the senators turn around and put his hand on his mouth and sort of whisper something to an aide. And there's a back and forth that's out of the mic range. And you see this going on, and the aide leaves and goes and does something. I talked to that aide after, and basically the senator was saying, who the F prepped this witness? Find out. This is a disaster.
That would be something that would actually happen in wrestling as well. But there's a term for all this that we use for wrestling, and I've used it for the media too, but you've done it from behind the scenes. Just explain to folks real quick when we're talking about things like prep and manipulating a storyline and getting down a promo. There's an overriding term for that gets used, and I kind of like to use it for politics too because I think it fits our media environment really well. But can you explain kayfabe to folks just briefly what that is, why that's such a big deal in professional wrestling, and why it applies to politics so readily?
I mean, I think kayfabe really means sort of what you're seeing in front of your eyes and what you're hearing with your ears is reality, and you're believing it's reality. However, behind that perception, it's not. So in other words, when two wrestlers are arguing with each other, having a feud, getting heated, throwing punches and everything, none of that is really real. Although, a particular zinger or two of a line people could react to and be like, whew, that was pretty harsh. And sometimes those lines might blur real life because sometimes two wrestlers could have had an issue in the past with each other or something very personal happened to a wrestler. In 99% of those cases, if something like that is said by one wrestler to another, something very personal, that line's already been sort of pre-cleared. with the other wrestler. Like they're going to make sure they don't piss each other off because at the end of the day, they are taking moves essentially onto some really thick plywood with a very bare cover of foam and a cloth tarp essentially, and that hurts. And they have to be mindful that that they're responsible for each other's physical safety in the ring. And you and I both know, Andrew, that injuries happen in wrestling and they can be pretty gruesome at times. So kayfabe is sort of like believing that what the wrestlers are saying to each other is real, and kayfabe is also believing that what the wrestlers are doing to each other is really hurting them. Now, I want to be clear. If there is a move in wrestling that happens like a suplex and you hear the thud and you go, ooh, that had to hurt, it probably did hurt, but they're also taking that move in the safest way possible. They have a lot of training on how to sort of distribute their body as their body hits the mat to sort of put that impact throughout their body rather than concentrating on one body part. And a lot of other moves that, are appear impactful and look to hurt, like the classic Ric Flair chops across the chest. I can say, as someone that has taken a chop across the chest, that absolutely stings like hell. But it's also one of those moves that there's no real permanent damage or issue, and you're basically fine after 10 minutes.
And what we now know as professional wrestling, like WWE, for example, that actually came out of the carnival days where somewhere along the line, we don't know when, two prize fighters at the carnival figured out that, hey, we can throw punches and fake this thing and they'll still throw money at us. And then when we go to the next town, we can just switch roles and you can be the good guy and I can be the bad guy and we can make even more money. That's where pro wrestling that we understand it came from. Two guys decided that, hey, why are we taking these punches when we can fake it and still make money? It's a path of least resistance thing in a way, and that sure seems to be like a parallel for our governance right now, where there's a lot of buddy-buddy when you're in those elite circles of power of, hey, we can do the thing of least resistance here as long as we keep it going for the cameras. Nobody's going to know the wiser, and we can keep the money going in, doesn't it?
So I think this is a great point, Andrew. The path of least resistance. How is government funded basically these days? Compared to say 20 or 30 years ago. What we're seeing is these really big bills like the National Defense Authorization Act or any of these omnibus funding bills. That's where we're really seeing the actual funding mechanisms occur. That's where a lot of the bit of a politician's sort of policy goals and policy ideas sort of happen, rather than individual standalone bills. Like, just think about how much gets tacked on to these authorizing bills for funding for, in a given year. Like, every senator is trying to put something on the National Defense Authorization Act, because once that National Defense Authorization Act goes up to the Senate, it's going to be approved 90-10. And it's not going to matter who's in the White House or who's in control of the Senate.
And we saw this again just recently. Now they're working on the infrastructure bill, which is, a little bit of infrastructure and a whole bunch of other stuff in it. It doesn't seem like there's any other way to get legislation of significance through the system now, other than they've kind of developed a system where we're going to hold on to what we really want to do until we have a crisis point, and then we can slide it in. We're going to see it with infrastructure. We saw it with COVID, and you're an economist, so you understand this. We're going to see it again here come the end of September, because we're going to have another round of government shutdown theater, aren't we?
Oh, you're talking about the national debt limit, correct?
Yep, among other things, but yeah.
Yeah. So we are one of the very few countries in this world that has a debt limit. And Andrew, you're entirely right. That debt limit is entirely political theater. When Republicans have had unified control, they have passed budgets that have added to the national debt, and they had no problems doing that. When Democrats have had full control, they've had no problems doing it. Even when there's some split control, everybody says we're going to raise that. They agree to raise the debt limit. It is entirely political theater. It's there to allow a few rabble-rousers to say something and to, it does provide fuel for both parties. The Democrats, and right now, since they're the ones not typically associated with being against raising the debt limit, they can say, look at the Republicans, they're being so obstructionist. The Republicans can say, look, we're being fiscally conservative, but we know, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, there's not a single fiscal conservative really in Congress right now. And this is all lip service, and I detest this national debt limit because it is something that it's there that you just ignore. It's like if the police set up a speed trap or in your area, but basically they said, yeah, we set this up, but it's fake and it doesn't matter. You're just not going to care about that at that point. Or if your kid comes in and says, I'm going to hold my breath unless you actually do something for me. And you're like, okay, hold your breath. It's an empty threat. And it's also like, in terms on the other side, like for the Republicans that want to have this national debt limit, what would happen to this what would happen if we actually defaulted on some debt? The consequences of that are disastrous. And this is why we'll never, I'll explain very clearly to folks, why we'll never see the debt limit not be reauthorized, because the very first thing that people are going to physically feel or see, I guess see is better, is their Social Security checks will not come. And if there's any group of voters that votes consistently and at high rates, it is those elderly that are receiving Social Security checks.
And the other part of this that comes up, and that same group of people, folks don't understand economics. It is very much one of the orphaned social sciences. But the one term in economics that gets people's attention, and we're seeing it more and more on social media and in the news cycle now, is inflation. So when people start hearing things like debt ceilings, they start worrying about inflation. We kind of started this conversation a couple days ago. You talked about, and bring it back to the wrestling storylines, there's a storyline right now going where folks are worried about inflation. Should they be? What is it? Kind of explain it to me like I'm five, because people are starting to panic over inflation. And then if you start having a debt ceiling conversation in Congress where folks don't understand those nuances, it's probably just going to get louder as we go into the fall.
So first, let me just describe the wrestling story that's going on right now. There's a story in All Elite Wrestling, which you can watch on TNT on Wednesday nights. Plug for them. And it's a story about a wrestler named Hangman Adam Page. And Adam Page is sort of, his gimmick is that he's an anxious millennial cowboy. And that sort of a gimmick has sort of resonated with a pretty big audience. It hits very close to home. It's very reality based for a lot of folks that are millennials and Gen Z, and for a lot of Gen X as well. And they're telling a story about someone who thought they weren't good enough, who was a part of a very elite group of wrestlers but thought they didn't belong. They had imposter syndrome. They met a lot of setbacks. They took upon some bad habits. For Hangman, he drinks way too much. But then over time, they slowly start to build real, true confidence. They start to understand what real friendship is, and not the friendship that they had with these other folks before, and sort of a journey of sort of self-discovery and self-sufficiency and self-resiliency. And this is a very powerful story that's capturing a lot of folks' attention. And I definitely recommend people check it out. It's been brilliant. Fans were sort of clamoring to see the penultimate match between Adam Page and the friend that set off all of this, that left him behind, Kenny Omega. They thought that match was going to happen in a few weeks, but AEW put something into the story that basically said, look, Adam Page hasn't learned that he can fail at something, he cannot succeed, and he can still have friends that will accept him even though he didn't win. And so he had to lose a big match and have the friends that he currently has still accept him for who he is, for him to gain that last bit of sort of confidence to put him over the edge. And that's what we're seeing right now in the story. But there was a big tension in that story because the fans wanted the solution now. They wanted the resolution now. And then the best part of the story will be if you don't give the fans the resolution, if you actually tell the whole story, it'll have a much more satisfying ending and a much more satisfying story arc. So let's pull that back to inflation here. What we see right now is a lot of loud noises from loud voices saying that there is massive inflation and we need to do something about it immediately, or else we're going to see 1970 style hyperinflation. Okay, I'm willing to go out on a limb here and say hyperinflation's not happening in the U.S. Nor probably, in Canada or Britain or whatever. But let's break this down as to why these folks are doing this. And I want to be careful to say, I don't think that we should be Pollyannish and say there's no risk. This is akin to living in Miami where you know that a hurricane comes every few years, but it's probably not coming tomorrow. So, have a disaster plan ready, have some provisions, know what you're going to do, but otherwise go about and live your life like you would normally do. And that's what I encourage folks to be thinking about here. But you asked me to explain inflation like you were 5 years old, Andrew. It might be a 7-year-old explanation.
Good enough. Let's try it.
So, Andrew, we measure inflation based on a basket of sort of items, of stuff that people tend to buy, like food or energy or cars. Some of these items that we buy, there weren't a whole lot of them because of the virus shutting down a good part of the world economy as well as the U.S. economy for many months. And so that interrupted our plans to build and create these items that we would buy. And so we call that supply chain issues. And so a lot of the inflation that we are seeing right now in our data are sort of due to these temporary supply chain issues because we weren't just simply able to build stuff when everybody was shutting down their economy. And we saw this in a handful of industries. And so, this is very evident when you look at the price of used cars or the price of lumber, right? Wood got really expensive because people stopped cutting it for a while. So there wasn't a whole lot of wood available. So when there's not a lot of things available, the price tends to go up. But why is this likely temporary? And so this is what I see when I look at the data. I'm going to break down what people buy into stuff and services. Stuff, Stuff, are the items that we buy, your groceries, etc. When we look at this, the price of stuff rose, but not the price for the services. Services are like when you pay for your mechanic's time to fix your car. Stuff is the part, and the time is the labor. We didn't see the labor part going up to the degrees that we saw the stuff going up. At the same time that you had a bunch of stuff not being produced, the government gave out a lot of money to help people because we know that a lot of folks in industries such as retail or tourism really had their income cut because the government said we are shutting down our economy to protect people's lives and well-being. Okay? And so because we're shutting down the economy, we're going to give you some money to help you get through this. Giving that money meant that people could buy things sooner than they would have otherwise. But the money that was given out isn't a permanent feature, except perhaps the child tax credit, which, as an aside, I believe is a great policy. And I see it being supported by both liberals and conservatives because it's both a pro-family formation policy, pro-natalist, but also pro-lower income support. Aside from the child tax credit, I think that's the only sort of permanent feature we're going to see post-COVID coming out of this. So a lot of this COVID spending that we saw the government undertake is just not going to happen going forward. Right? So we're not going to see that sort of stimulus happening in the future. So the government's not going to be giving money for people to buy more stuff next year. In addition, one reason why I think this is still temporary is we still have a lot of room to bring people back to work. We know that the unemployment rate is still pretty high compared to before the COVID happened, especially for Black and Hispanic persons and for certain segments of women, particularly those that took on childcare duties because childcare centers closed down. And women were more likely to assume the childcare duties than men during the crisis. We also know that if we look at how many people are employed in the U.S. to the total population of the U.S., that's at 58% right now. The lowest that it got was about 51% in April 2020. But before the pandemic happened, our employment population rate was 61%. So we still have, a couple of percentage points to go to get back to where we were. And we were having a pretty good economy for most people in 2019. We were starting to see wage growth. Across a broad swath of people. We weren't seeing high inflation. We were seeing a lot of business activity. This was great. So there's a relationship between unemployment and inflation. We call this the Phillips curve, and it just says how much inflation can we expect based on how much unemployment or employment there is. And it used to be a long time ago that this relationship was pretty stark. In other words, we saw a pretty clear relationship between unemployment and inflation. Now we say this curve is sort of more flat, like there's really not a lot of bend here. And basically means there's little chance for inflationary pressure to materialize once the economy gets running at sort of what we call full capacity or full employment. Now, one last thing that I want to say before I go into what what could be why inflation isn't temporary. Is I want to touch upon what's called a base effects issue, and you've probably heard this in the media. If we look at the data in late 2019 and early 2020, and we look at year-over-year changes in inflation, we see they're actually negative in that period. But then in late 2020 and early 2021, we see big positive changes, right? But they're big positive changes because we had big negative changes right before it. And so when we look at year-over-year changes right now, it's sort of creating a misleading picture, I think, about what's actually happening with inflation. Now, so as I said, I really do think that we have a lot of evidence that more supports the story that inflation is going to be temporary. Lumber prices have come down. Other goods that had supply chain issues, their prices are coming down. We're seeing economic activity pick back up again. We're seeing housing prices actually stop rising after rising dramatically over the last year. At least in the data, we're seeing more homes going for at list or even under list now. So that's encouraging. We're seeing, on the housing market, we're seeing home supply actually go back up again after being well below what we consider a healthy market level. So this is all good signs that inflation is temporary. Now, what's the one thing that could actually work against this? And it's something called inflation expectations. So if we think there's going to be inflation, then there's going to be inflation, right? We're sort of build it in. Like, if I'm afraid that I'm going to have pain when I go to the dentist, any tiny little pain that the dentist has when they're poking around my teeth is going to be magnified because I'm already geared up to fear it. Expectations are for right now, if we poll most of Americans, they're basically feeling that inflation is temporary. But of course, there are some very loud voices that are basically saying we have massive inflation, we need to do something now. And to the extent those loud voices take over, we could actually wind up fearing ourselves into higher inflation. And this was something that we didn't have to have, and we're only going to have it potentially because we just wanted to be afraid of something. And that's kind of sad. And to finish this, why is this happening? Because there's an election happening in a year. And the Republican Party sees an opening to attack Biden and the Democrats over inflation and use this as a political cudgel to get themselves, back in control of the House. That might lead to a very short-term win for them, but honestly, that's going to be a long-term loss for America. Not in terms of Republicans winning. It's in terms of inflation. If they win and inflation was higher, it's because we feared ourselves into having inflation.
So we talk about the storyline then. What are we watching for to where that fear goes from just folks spouting off on social media? You understand how the government actually works on these things. What's the government steps that we should watch out for then? It's going to be an election year. We're getting ready to go into a fall where there's a lot of uncertainty with the COVID stuff and kids going back to school, which I think the kids in the school situation was probably the most underreported economic factor of the COVID crisis because that just jacks up everything else. What should we look for? Because if there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of media pressure that starts to go onto the Biden administration, what's something that they might do, either knee-jerk or trying to make things better, that we should really watch for and go, oh, that's not good?
Well, I agree with you, Andrew, on the story of kids and what was going on with schools and how that affected people's economic decisions. One of the things that we've seen, there was a claim that this unemployment insurance benefit that was being paid was basically letting people stay away from the workforce. The data that we've been seeing and the studies that I've been reading really suggest that when these UI benefits were taken away, folks did not return to the extent that, it was claimed they would be returning to the workforce. And I think in part because of that child care issue and what should they be doing. And that issue hasn't gone away, especially with the rise of the Delta variant. And so, I wish that we would pay more attention. Of course, there's also, there was attention paid to what was happening to school outcomes for these kids that were stuck at home for a year and doing online learning, and some kids being successful and some not. But in terms of like the story and what to watch for, mainly what I'm going to be watching is what the Federal Reserve is saying, because they're really a government agency that sort of got the levers on policies that can prevent inflation from taking off. And right now, what we see from language, not just from Jerome Powell, but from the vast majority of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors who make the policy, is that they still believe things are transitory. They adjustments to reopening. But, if their language starts changing, right, and that'll clearly be reported on when they have their meetings. They have these things called open market committee meetings, and they happen about, I think, every 2 months. And so we'll be paying attention every time, they kind of come out here and they say, well, here's where we think we are and here's where we think we're going. And I'll be watching where the individual governors have of where they think inflation is going. Are their expectations rising, right? And so if I see those expectations rising, I'm going to start thinking that maybe they're seeing that this inflation is becoming more permanent than they would have liked.
Jericho Hill, I feel smarter already just listening to all this, and I get to do this offline with you because I'll ask you economic questions, so I'm glad to get to share it with everybody. Let folks know where they can find you on Twitter and places like that. You write for Ordinary Times. Just tell people where they can find you so that they can continue to benefit from your wismoniousness on economic issues, and they may want to shoot you some wrestling questions once in a while as well.
I'd be happy to take both, and I don't pretend to be a genius on all things economics. Doing inflation is a little bit out of my bailiwick, where I'm typically I'm a housing economist in real life, but I'm happy to sort of do what I can here on this to help the readers of Ordinary Times and listeners of Heard and Tell. And I also just want to say, I think I've greatly enjoyed being a contributor to Ordinary Times over the last year and a half, and always have intentions of writing more than I actually write, but I appreciate Andrew getting on my case every now and then to say, write something. You can find me both on Ordinary Times and on Twitter at Motoconomist, MOTOCONIMIST. Yeah, I spelled that right. Okay. But you can find me on there, and I'm always happy to chat about this stuff. And if I can help people understand it, all the better. And if you've got interesting stories and interesting ideas, I'd love to hear them as well.
We're gonna have to sit down and talk about the time where we did the movement where we took the WWE guys to Iraq the first time we worked that aircraft. I'll tell you that story one of these days. And
oh my God, that would be an amazing story.
But that's another story for another day.
Many years ago, I was at a party for a wrestling organization where I unfortunately lost to current WWE superstar AJ Styles, and let's just say that I had to do something pretty embarrassing at that party, and while I did it, wrestlers can be interesting in the stipulations they put.
Hey, if you're booked, you got to perform what you were booked to do. That's how that works. But
if I wanted to have their respect and be able to interview them and do that, if you're going to be with the crew, you got to be with the crew 100%. And so, yep, I lost. I took the lump. I took the L.
He's now one of the boys. And one thing you'll never find either one of us doing anywhere, whether it's social media, Ordinary Times, we're never going to be in a spelling bee. That's for sure. So, Jericho Hill, though, I appreciate
sure about that.
Yeah, it is. Jericho Hill, I appreciate your time today. Don't worry about the writing thing. Do it when you can because we enjoy it. You have a toddler. That's a good excuse. And I look forward to talking to you again real soon, sir.
Thank you, Andrew. Everybody have a great day.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Something that came up in our conversation with Jericho Hill, the path of least resistance is how professional wrestling developed into the entertainment form that it is now, and it also seems to be how we're being governed. It's interesting, we watch people, we can say something like actions, not words, but if we don't take the time to discern those actions and parse them out from the words that are being said, it's easier said than done, and we kind of start to miss the point. It's a lot of hard work to do that. The easier path, the path of least resistance, is always to just take what we're being presented on a screen or in a tweet or in a viral video or on a television newscast at face value and not understand that there's things going on behind the scenes. It takes a little extra work. But that extra work is a part of your citizenship. If we're going to be engaged citizens in the politics and cultural arenas, we need to make sure we're getting good information. And part of that good information is understanding that what you're being presented is just that, a presentation. That doesn't mean it's not got truth in it. It just means we need to discern it. And that's what we try to do here on Heard Tell. We try to turn down the noise, get to really good information. And you may not always agree with the information, but once you turn down the noise, you can at least have a discussion about it. And we're proud to continue to try to present that. Kind of like they have in wrestling. You have the heels, which are the bad guys, and the faces, which are the good guys. But the whole point of all of it is not who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. It's to keep you watching and to keep the revenue going in and to keep the business going. Can you have a lot of fun doing that? Absolutely. Is it entertaining? Absolutely. Is it still a business? Yep, sure is. So let's keep that in mind, that when we're watching a newscast, newscasts are business. The government, for a lot of people, is a business. It's a livelihood. And people that comment on it, ourselves included, it can also be a business. So let's all be smart fans and understand what we're dealing with. When we're parsing out truth, we need to understand the environment we're working in. A lot of people in business for themselves. It's not a bad business. It can be an entertaining business. But let's understand the business. That's it for this edition of Heard Tell. We thank you so much for joining us. However you're finding us on whatever platform you're listening to, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, Google, wherever you find us, if you could give us a rating and leave a comment, that would be great. We will respond to those comments, and those ratings are really important because it lets the platforms and other people to know that our little programs are worth checking out. We have 18 episodes done now. Thank you so much. Since we started this program right around the 1st of June, right after the Memorial Day weekend, you folks have really responded. It's grown and done well, and it's been better than we even thought it would be received. We understand what we're doing here isn't really flashy. It's not a trending thing. It's going to be a little bit of a slow burn, but it's finding its audience, and that's because you're taking the time to listen to what we're doing. So we're going to continue to make sure your time is well spent by giving you the best information we can possibly give you, giving you good guests that you may not get to hear other places, but that you need to hear as part of our discussions on college law and politics. As always, thank you. None of this works without y'all listening. So wherever you are across the street and around the world, we really hope this finds you and yours to be well. Till we talk to you again, y'all take care.
All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.
Summer concerts, pool parties, chill nights under the stars. We're stocking up our closet so you're ready to look your best for all of it. At Plato's Closet in West Ashley and North Charleston, we're buying all things summer. So bring in your tees, tote bags, sandals, sunglasses, and more. We pay cash on the spot for gently loved name brand looks. Plato's Closet is the go-to destination for trend-forward teens and young adults who support local and shop sustainable. Visit Plato's Closet today. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.